Welcome, everyone. Hello. Hello, hello. How are you on this cold night? Okay. Not sure. So happy to see you here at the Center for Brooklyn History. My name is Marcia Eli. I organize all of the programs here, and I get to say hello and greet you on behalf of the colleagues here at the center and the Brooklyn Public Library, which we are now a part of, as many of you know, and the Arts and Culture team BPL Presents. So it's really, really a pleasure to partner with the Municipal Art Society on this conversation about the changes that are in the works for Atlantic Avenue, and more importantly, how this local example helps us understand larger questions of what change means for people living in neighborhoods in terms of equity, affordability, investment of resources, preserving what's valued, heading off gentrification and displacement, and the many other essential and complicated considerations that our city and our communities must work through in order to effect successful progress. I want to really thank especially Rebecca Mackless of MAS, tonight's moderator. She has guided the development of this program on so many levels. Thank you, Rebecca. Here at the Center for Brooklyn History, we have weekly free programs, and often these are about neighborhoods and the larger city. As examples, and hopefully to entice you to come back, I'm excited to share that later this spring we are partnering with the Institute for Public Architecture and the Brooklyn Heights Association on a panel about the BQE. And we'll welcome some of New York's leading architects for a conversation inspired by Barbara Lee Diamondstein Spielvogel's latest book, Beyond Architecture, The New New York. And we're planning a multi-part series that takes a deep dive into climate change and environmental justice in New York City and beyond. You also may have seen signage cordoning off the ramp and the inner lobby over here. That's because we're in the process of installing our new exhibition opening at the end of this month titled Traces. Traces explores the legacy of slavery in Brooklyn. I hope that you'll come back to visit the exhibit or join us for some, or better, all of these upcoming programs. And a final word of invitation, please stay, mingle, and continue tonight's conversation formally following the program. And again, a special thanks to MAS for providing the refreshments. Now it's my pleasure to introduce MAS's Carrie Butler to say a few words of welcome. Carrie is the interim president of the Municipal Art Society, which she originally joined as vice president of planning and policy in 2022. Previously, she held a number of roles at the New York City Public Design Commission, most recently as its executive director, overseeing the agency's review of public art, monuments, and complex large-scale capital projects. Please help me welcome Carrie.
Hello, hi everyone. Thank you, Marcia. And MAS is thrilled to be collaborating with the Center for Brooklyn History here at this event, which is part of our Enduring Culture initiative. And thank you, Marcia, for being such a great thought partner in this collaboration. And as we are here in this amazing library space, the Center for Brooklyn History, I do want to mention the importance of third spaces like libraries to building community, for community gathering, and for sharing our histories and stories. And as I think the preliminary budget was released today, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that it's important for us to raise awareness and advocate for more funding in the city budget for spaces like this. So before we dive into the discussion, I want to provide a little bit of information about what the MAS Enduring Culture Initiative is. We kicked this off last year. It's a research and advocacy initiative, and as the city is grappling with an affordable housing crisis, climate change, and also really reckoning with some of our longstanding systemic inequitable development and policies, MAS launched this initiative to identify an expanded toolkit for how we can preserve cultural heritage in place. So through this work, we're exploring how the city can bolster community resiliency and support longtime neighborhood legacy businesses, community anchors, and the rich layered culture that makes all of our neighborhoods unique. And of course, given Atlantic Avenue's rich history and long expanse and the upcoming Atlantic Avenue mixed-use plan and rezoning, we thought it would be a good place to start of this discussion about the nexus of preservation and progress. So I want to introduce our panelists. As Marcia noted, we have Rebecca Mackless, who is MAS's Director of Urban Design and Policy, who will be moderating the discussion. Kelly Carroll, who is a preservationist and Executive Director of the Atlantic Avenue BID. Ifoma Ibo, a multidisciplinary designer and founding principal of Creative Urban Alchemy. And Mimi Mitchell, a tenant advocate and longstanding member of Community Board 8. Thank you and welcome to the stage.
Thank you so much, Carrie. And Marcia, really big shout out to you and your team for the partnership here. I think it was a collaboration and thought partnership to get to tonight. So thank you. So I want to dive in. I have a long list of questions to ask all of you, but first I asked each to develop a 5-minute, they could go to 6 or 7 minutes, so if I cut them off, you know that's the time limit, presentation to give kind of context to each of their work leading into the conversation. So first, Kelly, let me pull up your presentation and then I will.
So I'm Kelly Carroll. I'm the Executive Director of the Atlantic Avenue BID, among other things. I like to use my spare time in helping communities, specifically with historic preservation. It's what I love very much and did for most of my career prior to coming to the BID. So let's jump in. I was asked to talk about a little bit of how I spend my day, and this is basically it. This was a poster that I made for New York City Bid Day, which celebrated 40 years of bids in New York City, and so that is what the community told us that they would like to see. Bids are, we have 75 of them in New York City. They were invented in Toronto, and they are incredible neighborhood resources. Most neighborhoods have one, so I encourage everyone tonight to figure out if you live near a bid or even in a bid, if you're lucky enough, and to reach out to them because they're like preservationists, they're people that really care about their communities that do really special work. So we're here to talk about Atlantic Avenue, and she is old. She is really old. So this is a map of the world's oldest subway, which is still under Atlantic Avenue. There's a manhole on Court Street that you used to be able to access. And that tunnel is there because Atlantic Avenue has been a commercial corridor really for 200 years. This Long Island Railroad branch connected to all the way out to Jamaica back in the 1830s, and we also had a connection to Lower Manhattan, which is where the word South Ferry came from. It was originally actually at Atlantic Avenue, not Lower Manhattan. So when I work on Atlantic Avenue, and when it's a truck route, it's really hard to remember that most of the building stock on Atlantic between the BQE and 4th is from before the Civil War. And because of that, we have 4 historic districts. When I started at the BID 2 years ago, I really wanted to take stock of what we had, analyze what are the bones that we have that I can build from. And one of the first things that became apparent was our amazing legacy businesses. We have Montero Bar that opened on July 4th, 1947, displaced during Robert Moses's construction of the BQE. It was originally located across the street. We have Damascus Bakery. They've been baking there since 1930. Of course, the famous Sahadi, which now has a satellite location in Sunset Park. Oriental Pastries, who's been baking there since 1968 and were refugees from Syria. And so I really wanted to spotlight these special businesses and what they mean to our community. So I began a monthly merchant spotlight, which told their stories and got the Brooklyn Eagle to do special runs about telling these stories and how they came to be. And eventually, this will be listed on the New York State Historic Business Registry with partnership from Andrew Gurnardis's office. So keep your ears and eyes open because there will be yummy Syrian food and a celebration coming up this winter. Another thing I took stock of was our amazing storefronts. They're unlike anywhere else in Brooklyn. There are some in Red Hook, but none that are this intact, and it's not only because they're landmarked. They are really the whole stretch of Atlantic Avenue. We have these wooden projecting storefronts, which I have used to attract new businesses to the district. It's very unusual to have storefronts this old that protrude into the public way. You're literally putting your wares on the sidewalk for people. And what's really interesting is that a lot of these storefronts have naturally become a brand identity for a lot of these stores, almost unconsciously. We have M. Patmos here, who's in the house tonight, and we have, who's a board member. This is a new business that just opened. This is a business, East Fork, that just came from Asheville, North Carolina. So even an out-of-state business realizes that these storefronts, our architecture, are really part of what they want their brand identity to be, which is a really powerful thing for a piece of architecture to do. So I like to microdose people with preservation. And one of the ways that I do it is with our monthly mystery detail. So every month I pick an architectural detail in proper vocabulary, and I engage on social media for people to guess where it is. And if they guess, they get swag from the bid. Another way I do this, microdosing, is to extrude historic material from different buildings on the avenue. So Benjamin Moore was an Irish immigrant. The paint business started on Atlantic Avenue. A spoiler, it burned down because there was no zoning back then. But I like to also look back and see who is living here. This is a 1940 census showing that most people living in what was a wealthy merchant's house were mostly from Syria and Spain. When I take stock of what's there today, I realize that we still have a large Arab population, including 2 mosques. However, these Arab populations are newly arrived from northern African countries as well as Yemen. So despite this population of Arab and Middle Eastern and Muslim immigrants being present for 100 years, there was never any cultural celebration of them that I was able to find that the bid had done. So in order to elevate them, I introduced Ramadan lights for the first time 2 years ago. This was met with much fanfare and appreciation of this community. To sustain this culture, I always try to feed people the food from our legacy businesses so that these tastes and recipes and celebrations can be sustained to the next generation. This year is the 60th anniversary of the New York City Landmarks Law, and I will be activating many things to tie into that as much as I can. I tie in public art with our terracotta street signs. If you see a terracotta colored street sign in New York City, it means you are in a historic district. We do walking tours, where I'm feeding people food from Oriental pastries. I do online walking tours with our friend Suzanne Spellin, many of which you probably know. But it isn't all pretty. We have a lot of problems and a lot of change coming. One of which is our traffic safety. We're a Vision Zero priority corridor, and people have gotten killed by cars. The BQE is going to be a major project that's going to transform this community, hopefully for the better, if our leaders listen to the community. And we also are, although we're landmarked, we're not all landmarked, and we do have a lot of new construction coming, some of which is more successful than others. So with that, come see us soon. There are shopping guides in the lobby, thanks to board member Sandy Balboza. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. And I will just say, quick plug as I'm pulling up the next presentation. We have food from Damascus tonight as the reception, one of the businesses. So please stay and eat. So sort of transitioning from Atlantic Avenue bid and legacy businesses and people in place in that way, I wanted to transition to Mimi, who's going to talk a little bit about her work in tenants' rights and housing advocacy and anti-displacement. So over to Mimi.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Mimi Mitchell. I'm a housing advocate, racial justice activist, and a philanthropist, and a horrible joke teller, as you can see. But for over a decade, I've worked to empower tenants with the legal tools that they need to stay inside of their homes. I find this work really enjoyable, but I also find it much more necessary than it should be. I'm excited to have this important conversation tonight. But one thing I want to make clear is that these are my opinions, my thoughts. I am not representing the community board, any organizations, any groups, etc. You just get pure, unfiltered Mimi Mitchell. Anyways, so as we start, I would like us to take a moment before we begin. I'd like to acknowledge that the land that we are discussing today is part of the unceded territory of the Lenape people. Their stewardship of this land predates us all, and it's essential that we honor their history and resilience. As we consider the future of this area, I'd like us to remain mindful of the need for equity and justice for all of our communities. So let's talk about the Atlantic Avenue Mixed-Use Plan, also known as AAMUP. So the Atlantic Avenue Mixed-Use Plan is a community-driven initiative aimed at revitalizing a 21-block stretch of Atlantic Avenue and its adjacent areas, neighborhoods like Brooklyn's Crown Heights, Bed-Stuy, Clinton Hill, Prospect Heights. The plan is to transform this corridor into a vibrant mixed-use area that includes residential, commercial, and light industrial spaces. So, of course, with changes like these, displacement is going to be an issue. So let's just take a quick stroll down Atlantic Avenue. It isn't just a street, and certainly as Kelly showed us, it's a living, breathing mosaic of cultures and histories and traditions. For decades, this area has been home to African American, Caribbean, Hispanic, and Jewish communities. Their contributions through businesses and cultures have made an indelible mark on the social and cultural fabric of the neighborhood. However, over the years, gentrification and rising rents have sparked a real demographic shift. For example, in Community Board 8, the white population has increased by 30,000 between 2010 and 2020. However, the Black population has decreased by 22,000. So these changes do challenge us to think critically about how we preserve the diversity that makes these neighborhoods, and especially Atlantic Avenue, so special. So let's talk about displacement. And what exactly is it? You might have heard of physical displacement. I think that that's the one that we're mostly all familiar with. And that's when rising rents and gentrification force people out of their physical home. But there's also cultural displacement, which can be just as devastating. Then that's when the heart and soul of neighborhoods and its traditions, institutions, and identity begin to fade because the people who built it can no longer afford to stay. This phenomena affects residential housing and also businesses. So finally, there is a much subtler type of displacement, one that I call indirect displacement. So what is it? Let me give you an example. Places of worship are often the heart of a community. So when residents are displaced and congregations shrink, these institutions tend to face tough decisions. Some of them even have to close the doors of their building. Let's take St. Joseph's Co-Cathedral as an example. Even though they have had a huge loss of Haitian and Hispanic parishioners, they have been displaced from the community. Luckily, these people still travel back for weekly mass, but it still threatens the fabric of our community. as new people who move in may not be as dedicated to their religion. So when a church closes, the ripple effects are just profound. We lose space for connection, social services disappear, and a vital piece of our neighborhood's fabric and soul is lost. So, how do we combat this? And how do we address it? And what's the best way to address it? Now, usually we say that we'll fight for tenant rights, but really and truly having strong tenant laws is number one, and number two is giving tenants the actual representation that they need in court. Tenants know their rights, but advancing them and being able to talk about it or being able to actually assert them in court is a whole different thing. So once again, if we really want to stop displacement, what we have to do is protect and save our tenants. So our final, there we go. So really, what is affordable housing? You know, we hear a lot of words about this, we talk about this a lot, and that is one of the great tools that we do have for fighting displacement. But what is it? Well, affordable housing is defined as housing for households earning 30% or less of the AMI. Let's just put it this way, 30% of your income should be spent on housing, not 50%, which is what most of us are spending on housing. So understand that this isn't just about the numbers, it's also about keeping families in their neighborhoods, protecting them from the effects of gentrification and ensuring diversity, cultural, economic, and social diversity in order to thrive. Affordable housing is the foundation of a strong community. It gives people a stability to invest in their neighborhoods and helps preserve the businesses, traditions, and institutions that make Atlantic Avenue so special. There we go. And sorry, I'm not great with these slides, clearly. Anyways, so there we go. So in closing, what I would like to do is encourage all of us to preserve our tenants by supporting strong tenant laws and also by supporting free legal representation in housing court for tenants that risk displacement. And I just want to remind us that the land that we're discussing here today was once the home of the Lenape people. Their displacement is a part of a broader history of cultural erasure and inequity. So as we move forward, let's also reflect on the lessons of history. We owe it to them and to every marginalized community to protect cultural heritage and ensure that projects benefit everyone, not just the rich.
Thank you, Mimi. It's almost like we're on the same page because I had a question about cultural versus physical displacement. So you went a couple minutes over, but maybe we don't need that question anymore. So it's okay, I'll let it slide. So next up, Ifoma, please.
Yes, thank you. And thank you both for that really enlightening presentation. My name is Ifoma Ebo. I am principal of Creative Urban Alchemy, and I also teach. I focus on design and sustainability at the Spitzer School of Architecture at City College in Harlem. And my practice, Creative Urban Alchemy, is a Brooklyn-based practice that centers equity, justice, and cultural heritage in the practice of art, architecture, urban design, and planning. And much of my work has been across the world, really, and these are the three key focus areas of my work: public art, advocacy, so public speaking, very much like what I'm doing right now, as well as working on projects, urban design, and planning that really have impact on community development. So my work has also been centered. I mean, my public artwork in particular has really been, much of it has been focused in and around communities of color, low-income communities, frontline communities, and or public housing communities, and really working with residents to build and support their creative agency and transforming their places and spaces through cultural heritage, working with youth as well, and really thinking and reimagining some of their open spaces so that they can be more powerful for community gathering and community cohesion. And so recently, myself and one of my project partners, Jerome Hayford, both of our studios came together to submit for the Exodus and Dance Story Walk Design competition, and that we won, and we're currently working on it. So Jerome Hayford is a studio based in Harlem, and mine is based in Brooklyn. And so both of us also very much entrenched and rooted in Black communities in both locations. So the project itself is based at the Kingsborough Houses, which is also along the Atlantic Avenue corridor, and it's located in a very special and significant place, particularly for Black history and heritage. Can I use this pointer? Is this a no? That's okay. I thought I could use the pointer, but. You can see Kingsborough House is at the center, and there are two significant assets in and around this area that are important for Black history and heritage. The first being Weeksville Heritage Center, and Weeksville is actually at a portion of Brooklyn that is sort of bleeds in between Crown Heights and Bedford Stuyvesant. And the Weeksville Heritage Center, which you see the image pointing to, is part of both Crown Heights and Bedford Stuyvesant. It was an independent, free Black community named for James Weeks. The center is a repository of efforts by free Black people to create their own intentional community. So you can actually go to Weeksville Heritage Center and visit the historic homes of Weeksville and understand and learn about how Blacks came together during that era to form this intentional community. And it's right across the street from Kingsborough Houses, which is a public housing development. And then Kingsborough Houses is also the home of Exodus and Dance, or referred to as the Wall. You can see in the center. It's referred to as the Wall by residents in Kingsborough Houses community, and it's the largest piece created by Richmond Barté, who is an artist in this image. And he was a prominent African-American sculptor and painter during the Harlem Renaissance, until he passed, I think, in the late 80s. And Mr. Barté is known for his work inspired by Christianity, Black history, and African folklore, theater, and dance. The frieze, which you see in the center, is the long, narrow, horizontal sculpture that decorates the center walk at Kingsborough Houses, the campus, and it was commissioned by the New York City Progress Administration in the 1950s. So this is one of the most significant pieces of art on a public housing development, I would say, across the city itself. And it was originally intended to be in Harlem. It was going to be displayed at Harlem River Houses, which is another significant Black community, historic Black community. But after Mr. Barté completed the piece, it was installed at Kingsborough Houses, reflecting similar journeys of early Black communities between Harlem and Bedford Stuyvesant. It represents a connection across historic Black communities of New York City and a repository of those stories of journeys of migration. And so the name of the piece itself is Exodus and Dance. Exodus, sort of recalling the Exodus of the Bible, and the passage and movement of Jews out of Egypt, but then also the movement of Black people from the South to the North, escaping Jim Crow laws. So this was a piece that not only sort of embodied his appreciation for Christianity and his faith, but then also just like wanting to hold the stories of people moving, Black people in particular, moving across the country, across the city as well. And so the dance part of the frieze is about freedom and liberation and joy, and Black joy in particular. And so when you see the frieze up close, you can see the features of the art itself. You can see the wide nose, and the features themselves definitely demonstrate that these are Black people that he's depicting. He's also finding inspiration from Egyptian art, and so wanting to sort of also hold and this piece serve as a repository for a Black aesthetic. And so we looked to some of his inspirations, Egyptian reliefs. We looked at sort of Egyptian constellations as tools for navigating in Egypt. And we also looked to Egyptian hieroglyphics, because these were the inspirations of Richmond Barthé. And then through our engagement process, we really wanted this idea of exodus and dance, stories of migration, stories of joy to be front and center, and really understand who Kingsborough Houses is, who the people of Kingsborough are, through this storytelling. And so through our engagement process, we also looked at Growing Up Kingsborough, which is written by a former resident of Kingsborough Houses, but then also learning from residents on what was their migration story, how did they end up in Kingsborough. And many of them who were, senior elders, as you can see in the image, were telling stories of moving up to the north or moving to Kingsborough from being in the south, or having a dream that they were going to live in Kingsborough and then fulfilling that dream by moving to Kingsborough Houses. And then we also engaged the young people about their stories and how they connect to open spaces in and around their public housing development, and the importance of those spaces to forming community. But they also shared, and these are the key themes that came out of our workshops, not only the dreams of wanting to get to a better place, and Kingsborough being that place, but then also the importance of open space in and around public housing as forming community, and that there was a loss of that because their open spaces had disintegrated over time. But they're now in the process of being restored and renewed. As well as the historic art piece and the frieze. We also used our process to tap into creative agency of the community at Kingsborough Houses. Who are the artists, and how can their artwork be integrated into our art piece? And so we were tasked with creating an art installation that tapped into the stories of exodus and dance and make them come alive across the campus, in addition to the restoration of this historic frieze. So we also, we wanted to learn from what Richmond Barthé was exploring. He was exploring sort of this Black aesthetic, exploring ancient Egyptian art and architecture. And so we tapped into that as well, looking at material, and also thinking about constellations, sort of the placement of art pieces as a support in navigating the campus itself, but then also to encourage this sense of discovery. So we came up with this process of, different forms of art, small, medium, and large, that would be dispersed across the Kingsborough Houses campus, and that create this sense of discovery across the campus. This is the large piece, and that it also serves as a repository and holds some of the narratives that we collected from residents, some of their drawings and etchings, that each installation art piece can also, and very much in the same way that the Exodus and Frieze piece is a repository of history and story, that it could also do the same thing for residents on their campus, as well as telling the story of Exodus and dance. And so the pieces were really also about, the location of the pieces. We walked around with the residents to really tap into where do they enjoy coming together, where do they hope to come together further, and how can we amplify these places and spaces with these art pieces that are also tapping into this Egyptian-inspired art. And that the Great Walk, the campus has a number of different walks across the campus that they can be emphasized to really encourage people to come out and enjoy these spaces, and also, foster a sense of community, really use their open spaces to foster community. And so each of these pieces are also holding the etchings of drawings that residents have created, their narratives of stories of coming to Kingsborough Houses, and really hope to sort of be that way of capturing the nostalgia that we heard through our engagement process. And so, thank you so much for allowing me to share. Thank you to the Center for Brooklyn History, as well as the Municipal Art Society, for this opportunity to share this work.
Let me just pull up a backdrop for us, and then we'll dive in. And just, I don't know if warning is the right word, but for the audience, I think we're going to go a little big and kind of get a little theoretical, and then we'll go back into Atlantic Avenue and the rezoning. So you all touched on so much, and I think you spoke, quite frankly, really beautifully about people in place in what I thought was going to be very distinct ways, but then it all sort of started overlapping. So good thing you're all on this panel tonight. I think you all touched a little bit on how you define preservation and cultural heritage and how you integrate that your day to day. I'm wondering, sort of rapid fire, we're not going to put it in a dictionary, but what is your working definition of preservation, and is that different from your view of how you define cultural heritage? Are those two things different to you?
For me, they are. I see preservation as cultural heritage, as the vehicle to sustain cultural heritage. For example, I'm half Polish. That's my cultural heritage. But doing a Christmas tradition that's endemic to the Polish ethnic group is preserving the cultural heritage. So for me, one is the means to the end.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that, and also add in, conservation into the mix. I think about some of the work that I'm involved in, and just the connection between the two presentations, and the fact that the way that gentrification can displace people can also displace the producers of cultural heritage, the producers of these cultural heritage sort of repositories, whether it's the art or the events or the conversations. And so it's important to not only preserve, but also to conserve, to create opportunities where they can be advanced, where they can be supported, so that it's not only about holding them, but also advancing them and giving them more energy to continue into the future.
And just to piggyback off of what Ifoma just said, for me, preservation, it's more about community, and it's the traditions that a community actually starts to build. That's what we preserve to give to the young people in the future. Cultural heritage is more about what actually makes it something to preserve. It's the soul, it's the fabric of what actually created it. So as we saw with Ifoma's presentation in Kingsborough, that is a perfect example to me of preservation alongside cultural heritage. It's a perfect blend of the two, and it's also enduring and lasting.
And I loved, Ifoma, what you had said about capturing nostalgia, which I know is just a piece of the puzzle, but I thought that was a really beautiful way. As Carrie mentioned sort of at the beginning, part of the work MAS is doing with Enduring Culture is to sort of interrogate the field of preservation and understand, we're reckoning with the housing crisis, housing crisis, climate crisis, understanding how to support people in place. How do you all view your work to preserve? Is it in sort of conflict with this need to deconstruct and repair histories of marginalizing planning and policy, or is it in a way part of the solution to that? Do you view it as we can move forward, but we have to figure out how to preserve too, or can preservation, and what you're talking about, preservation being the mechanism of keeping cultural heritage, can that be part of our steps forward?
Sure.
I'll just insert bias as moderator. I'm hoping for this panel we can be the latter. I'm hoping we can find a way for them to kumbaya together, but curious, please push back.
So myself as a trained architect and artist, oftentimes the conversation of preservation is rooted in architecture, and it's about sort of, holding on to these historic assets that may not be positive memories for all. And they may not tell the story of all, okay? And we talking about how our buildings tell the story of Dutch settlement, British settlement, et cetera, and so forth. But there have been many communities that live and have inhabited a place. There's the indigenous story. And so what are the things that tell those stories? And so I think preservation is and should be about the multiple stories, the multiple narratives, and And how are those stories being held? How are they being preserved? How are they being remembered? And so myself as an artist, I see art as a tool for doing that. It's a tool for community to also preserve not only the historic cultures, but the present cultures, the cultures that are to be with the youth. And so I see that all of those things are important because as we continue into the future, our present will become history, right? And we still want to be able to remember who we were at different points in time, and art is a really great avenue for that.
Absolutely. Layers is something we've been talking a lot about. It's like not one, it's, the whole sort of symphony.
I don't see preservation and progress as being opposites. In fact, I believe that they actually complement each other. I think that when we build and we progress and we do it thoughtfully with culture in mind and with preservation in mind, I think that what we can do is we actually create a really cohesive community, one that is able to honor, one that's able to appreciate, and one that's able to leave legacy. And I think one of the biggest tools for that is actually deeply affordable housing. And that is one of the hugest goals because it's one of the ways that we can keep our tradition makers and our cultural heritage and the people who have actually created that and who are able to tell those stories and are able to progress to the future. It's keeping them in place and fighting the displacement because when they go, culture does go.
I agree with both of you. I think that there is an emphasis on architectural preservation, but I also believe that progress and preservation do complement each other. One example, several examples that I can think of is in my work working with all 5 boroughs in preservation campaigns, specifically Bushwick, East New York, East Flatbush, Bed-Stuy, Crown Heights, Harlem, East Harlem, Inwood. A lot of these campaigns, when they were seeking landmarking, which is architectural preservation, it was often many community members' first foray into being politically active. Because when you want to seek out to create a historic district, you have to have your council members' support. And then you have to show up to your community board. And I found that to be such a powerful tool of preservation about, even though the thing we're preserving is brick and mortar, when you empower a community to participate politically, that then bleeds into everything else and creates a culture of community that started maybe with landmarking, but now you have an active political base that's going to show up. The other thing I'd like to say is that I do think it's important to preserve the thing. Like a few years ago, the Central Harlem 132nd to 134th Historic District got designated, and I personally believe it's important for young kids to be able to go to the brownstone where the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom was organized. I think that that's important. It's one thing to read about something in a book, but if you can go up to that building and say, wow, this happened here. Someone who looked like me, somebody who helped us, did this thing here. I think that that's incredibly important. And finally, in terms of at least my section of Atlantic Avenue, the size of our small stores are bastions of creativity, of economic development, and I would go further and argue, I haven't done this, but someone should, you should look at a map of the 5 boroughs, and I will guarantee you that most historic districts also have a business improvement district, and that's because they're vibrant, they have investment, and they are places where people want to be.
I think I'm going to, Mimi, you so beautifully touched on cultural versus physical displacement. So I'm going to assume that everyone retained that and that we now understand how those two go hand in hand. And I wanted to transition to, and what actually you were just speaking on, and political and people having their voices and being heard, and from what you were saying of layers of history. Sorry, I'm working on speaking into the mic. I'm wondering how each of you in your work reconcile or have confronted competing stories and memories and voices. How does, different communities who want, their third spaces. How, has there been conflict, and how have you navigated that, Mimi? IFOMA with community members and integrating, what manifests in public artwork and in your businesses. IFOMA, you're nodding, so I'll
Yeah,
leave to
I
you.
actually wanted to bring this up, but I was like, I don't know, is there enough time to talk about this? So in another life, I worked for HPD and planning affordable housing, and what was so interesting for me was how preservation was actually weaponized often, or sometimes, depending on the neighborhood. For people who do not want people living in affordable housing living in their community, the historic preservation card gets pulled up. Oh, you can't build another building here. It's going to conflict with the way that our community looks. You can't build it too tall. You can't have too many units. And the undertone there is not in my backyard. Do not bring these people into my community. Don't bring so much. Don't bring so many of them into my neighborhood, because I don't want my neighborhood to change. So that was definitely something that I saw as sort of just like a thorn in the side of preservation. And, that's in one instance. And, in that conversation, you sort of just have to really bring in people into the conversation that are the older time residents that don't want things to change, but then also the younger residents that are moving into the community and really are open to inclusivity. Now, in another project where I was working at the Flatbush African Burial Ground, supporting a community-based organization to activate and amplify the burial ground through art and programming, this was also going to be a site for affordable housing. And so this is now a different kind of conflict, where the preservation of this historic site and the story of this site was in jeopardy of being lost because the city wanted to build affordable housing on that site. And it's also about the preservation of just open space, particularly in a community that's dealing with extreme heat. And so these are two wins for community affordable housing, which was very much needed in this neighborhood, but then also the preservation of this important historic site was also important for this Afro-Caribbean community. And so I think there was a tug of war here. Inevitably, the community pushed back, and the affordable housing project was stopped and moved to a different location, so that the community could have this space to preserve the traditions, the stories, and it's still ongoing. It's not a perfect, seamless story, but I think these are two examples of how the benefits, that there's these trade-offs that happen often in these conversations around whether it's a preservation of open space, the preservation of communities, the anti-displacement, that sometimes that there can be a tug-of-war between all these different benefits.
I think she covered it.
Well, it's funny. I was going to ask you, Mimi, and I know you're speaking on behalf of yourself, not CBH, but I know you've had a long-standing involvement with the AAMUP plan, but also tenant advocacy rights, in the community and Prospect Heights. And sort of building on what IFOMA was saying, like, what happens when the plan that has intentions to solve for the problem you're advocating for perhaps is then in conflict with some of the work you're doing? So if, Atlantic Avenue mixed-use zoning is, I think it's around 5,000 units, over 1,000 of affordable units, but then you're saying, oh, part of the result is there going to be displacement, and then how do we reckon to that? So I'm wondering, how you've navigated that compromise.
Haven't. I'm joking. First of all, let me just say that there are Community Board 8 members who've been working, are you hearing me? Who've been working on this for like over 10 years. My involvement is rather short when we compare it to them, so I just want to give them their just due. When the conflicts arise, and there are conflicts, for me at least, as a tenant advocate with AAMUP, and I don't believe that there is enough affordable housing. I also don't believe that the programs that are put in place for anti-displacement are going to be the most effective. And that is like my biggest kind of, pain in the butt, my biggest point of advocacy. And really, at the end of the day, it takes true listening. Like, that is something that I'm finding, we do these panels and people give their opinions and the city says, okay, and Crystal Hudson did a great study. And the study shows very clear indications of what the community wants and needs. Yet, when we get the final plan, those things are forgotten, or they're just not addressed, or they're just not effectively addressed. And that's where I find a lot of the conflict happens. So what do we do? What do we do when I see, something like AAMUP? I protest. I get out here and I let everybody else know what's really going on, and I think that's what we all have to do. We have to be active. We have to be active in our community. We have to be active in raising our voices, even when our voices are being silenced, even when, there are others who are trying to sell us something that we know is not going to work. We still got to be able to push back. We still have to always, once again, listen. Just listen. I believe that there's always a way to compromise, and there's always a way to, the resources will provide, and we can do it, but we have to actually listen, and we have to actually go in with an attitude that says, we're ready to compromise, we're ready to build on these things. How do we do it together, as opposed to seeing each other as opposites?
No, that was great. I mean, maybe the flip side, and Kelly, you hinted at this a little bit, was what happens when things that you might imagine to be in conflict are actually in support of each other? Like, do landmark districts actually impede economic development, or do you see a positive correlation? And sort of what is that relationship in your bid and in your past work?
So first of all, 4% of New York City is landmarked. So think about that. 96% of all the other tax lots, minus the nonprofit, are as of right development. So I really don't buy the argument that historic districts, in terms of their land makeup, are impeding any type of progress or affordable housing production. On Atlantic Avenue, we still have a lot of rent-stabilized tenants. We're a business district where the buildings are still owned by families, not LLCs. And it's that type of, which I won't even call gentrification. Gentrification, the original definition was like people moving into an area and improving it, like a kind of a natural process. What's happening with humans no longer owning property in our cities, and LLCs and shell companies and foreign investors, that's not gentrification, that's something else. I think we need a new word. But I think, and I said this in my last reply, I think our historic resources are economic drivers of our city. Now, what do we send postcards of New York? What are they postcards of? Are we sending postcards of the Williamsburg waterfront? No. We're sending postcards of Grand Central Terminal, of Brownstone, Brooklyn, of Harlem, Brownstone, Harlem, of the Empire State Building, the Chrysler Building, Statue of Liberty. So and that's another thing. Preservationists especially, need to do a better job about linking tourism to our landmarks. That's what people come from all over the world to see. That's what we go see when we travel abroad. Are the landmarks, right? And the beaches and other stuff, but mostly it's buildings. So I see them very much going hand in hand, and I think that in my presentation it really showed that the little buildings that we have, the little storefronts that we have, are what people really love and what sustains us as a distinct destination within the context of the city.
Running on time, a little over, but I just wanted to ask two more questions before we open up into the audience so that we can bring it back to the AAMUP proposal. On the way back to this rezoning, I wanted to ask each of you, in your work, what is the biggest roadblock that you're confronting in supporting what you're doing better? I mean, I think you've touched a little, like Mimi, you were saying legal support, and Ifoma, you were talking a little bit about this competition between the open space and the housing, but is there procedural roadblock that if you had a magic wand, you would say, this is what I'm moving? And what would you have that change be? What policy change would you make to help your work? I'm giving you the magic wand for 2 minutes, so take it. I think Mimi has her magic wand locked and loaded. What would you?
I think of that magic wand daily, trust me. And that, Nas song with Lauryn Hill on it. If I ruled the world, yeah, that it comes into play here. But honestly, what would I do if I had a magic wand? I'd probably stop a lot of luxury development, to be honest. I probably wouldn't be offering 3,000 studios in my neighborhood. Truthfully speaking, I probably wouldn't want. I don't mind the housing being built because, yes, clearly, I think we all agree that we need housing. But I'd love to see a studio for $1,000, and I'd love to see buildings full of that, and I'd love to see housing lottery winners not have to pay extra money to use the facilities and amenities of these buildings, which is another dividing factor and another displacement factor, because you can also have internal displacement where you live. And we see that in some of the deeply affordable apartments where they're only on one side of the building, or the amenities are not for everyone. It's just, once again, promoting that same division that we're trying to fight against. So if I ruled the world, every tenant who is facing displacement would have free legal representation. That would be number one. Number two, we'd have even stronger tenant laws. Number three, we would actually have laws that punish landlords. Right? That actually punish landlords for things like fraud, things like harassment, things like abuse. Landlords do what they do because they're really, the flip side of it, the downside of it is not big enough to prevent them from doing it. It's just collateral damage. It's just the cost of doing business.
Yes, yes, and yes. And one thing you were saying about studios and units, right? It's not just the number of affordable housing units, but they can't just all be studios and one bedrooms. We need to be
the other thing
provisioning
too, right?
family-size units and multi-generational units.
And making units that are going to support a growing neighborhood and growing families, and keeping them at a level that is affordable for everyone. Maybe we should have apartments. Yeah, you know what? If I had a wand, I would make apartments where everyone only paid 30% of their income, no matter what your income level was. How's that? I think that's what I'd do.
Yeah. And I know, Foma, go ahead.
Yeah, I think, and that just sparked thank you for sharing that. That just sparked a thought for me in terms of, much of my work is about transforming public spaces. And oftentimes, particularly in communities that have not received a lot of investment, and now all of a sudden there's a significant amount of investment to improve, whether it's streets or parks, plazas, open spaces, whatever they may be, there's a fear. There's a fear that this improvement is not for me, that this improvement is being used to increase the value of this area so that I can be displaced, so that the property taxes can be raised, my landlord can kick me out, and then get in whoever is supposed to be coming in here to enjoy this new an improved amenity. And so I feel like, and oftentimes I find that when doing these public space projects, that there isn't a collaboration with the housing agency or housing department to really think about, is the housing in that community stabilized so that once this amenity is now ribbon cutting and everything, that the people who will live in that community can continue to live there, that they will continue to have affordable housing available for them to live in, and that amenity is really and truly for them, that the neighborhood was thought of sort of cohesively and not just like in silos in terms of the way that work is being done. So if there's an improvement to the park, there's also stabilization of housing so that there isn't that displacement that often comes from these types of infrastructure improvements.
Magic wand.
Yeah, you got it.
For my job, I would mostly focus, obviously my job is to help the mostly small businesses that I help. And you know, every small business, now that I've been doing this a couple of years, every small business in this town is really a miracle. Like, I don't know how they do it. The city throws new regulations as they feel like it. We all need to containerize our trash, but there's nowhere to store it. You can have outdoor dining, but you're not allowed to have it up all year because there's nowhere to store it. They're constantly getting fined. We'll call the sanitation department. They don't even know the pickup times. So they're accruing all of these expenses on their own time while they're trying to educate themselves and run a business. And, you know, we're lucky enough to have an entire city agency dedicated to helping small businesses, and it's called Small Business Services. It's a city agency, just like the police or sanitation or LPC or PDC or HPD. Some of them are in the house tonight. Thank you for coming. You know, you would think that in a city where you have a city agency dedicated to helping small businesses, that some of their biggest pain points would not be legal. Things like all of our businesses paying for the bid tax. That's supposed to be paid for by the property owner. And this happens all of the time, and it's called a triple net lease, and this is totally legal because of our real estate lobby. You know, when you're a small business, taking on that extra tax is really encumbersome, depending on which business district you're in. I'm a small bid, so for my businesses, it's like $900, $1,500 a year, which is worth it to keep your sidewalk clean, by the way. 600,000 pounds of trash picked up last year just on Little Atlantic. The other thing is property taxes are passed down onto these small businesses. So there's a lot of, if I had a magic wand, like let them just run their business, and why are they taking on the responsibility of their landlord, who which I'm going to segue to, the landlords also can just triple the rent and then they're out. I had Floyd leave 2 weeks ago. It was a dive bar on Atlantic Avenue for 20 years. And they're going to be reopening on Clark Street, Brooklyn Heights. So you're getting a new bar very soon. But they wanted to be on Atlantic. And it's because their lease expired and the landlord, they couldn't afford it. So I know that we live in a capitalistic society, but if we're talking about cultural heritage, and New York loves its legacy businesses so much and the ethnic businesses, then maybe we should explore something like commercial rent stabilization. Maybe. Not for every business, but if a business that's thriving is forced to close only because of rent, I don't think that's right. You know? The other thing, too, is we should look at other cities, what they're doing. We have a lot of vacancy here. We have a lot of commercial vacancy in New York City, especially in Manhattan after COVID. Our city isn't working the same way. And there's literally no consequence for that. I was just in Toronto over the holidays visiting my friends, and if you have a vacancy on your property in Toronto, you pay a tax, and a hefty one, to disincentivize that, because empty storefronts, even in wealthy neighborhoods, is still blight. It's an unsafer street, it's a darker street, it's unsafer for everybody. And the last thing I'll say is, yeah, that's pretty much it. I'll stop. Yeah. Yeah.
You have a whole...
Okay. Yeah.
We can take the magic toolbox while we eat Damascus and continue to talk about it. So just the last question I wanted to ask before opening to the audience, and it might be a little woo-woo, but it's based in Atlantic Avenue and the rezoning. So the community was working on this rezoning and visioning for 10 years, and I'm wondering, each of you touch Atlantic Avenue in such different ways and in different parts. I know, Kelly, your bid is outside of the scope, but it's still going to be impacted by all this infrastructure upgrade. So, I'm wondering, in light of all the conversation today, 10 years from now, what's your hope for the layers of history along Atlantic Avenue, and how heritage plays a role in the built environment, and how we're going to move forward to the next chapter of this corridor?
I hope that in much the same way that spaces like Weeksville Heritage Center, the historic Exodus and Dance Freeze, as much the kinds of efforts that are being made to restore these spaces, to make them available for people to see, sort of a window into history, that same level of effort is made to hold the small businesses that are hiring people in the community, the people, the leaders, the community leaders that are at the center of a lot of the cultural production that happens in that community, that a lot of these intangible assets are preserved in the same way that the tangible, the physical architecture, the art assets are being preserved and restored.
It's a good question. I had not thought about it. In 10 years, though, I would love to see a balanced Atlantic Avenue, one that balances culture, history, and new development and progress with that new development. I think that those things can go hand in hand and they can exist side by side. But the one way to do it, once again, is going to be through keeping the people of this community inside of this community, making housing affordable, making home ownership affordable. Because even if we have, let's say, an affordable housing building right now, we have a family in it, we want those kids to be able to grow, not in just that apartment, but we want them to be able to find housing within the neighborhood, because that's who's going to take care of their parents later, right? Which is also going to relieve some strain on the city. So I think it's really important in 10 years from now to make sure that we right now are looking towards the future and towards the generations that are going to come and making a commitment to keep that as diverse financially, culturally, and socially as we can.
My hope is that with all of this affordable, air quote, affordable housing that's being built, for the policy to actually change, AMI is currently includes Westchester and Rockland counties. What does that have to do with the boroughs? Like, those incomes are totally different than what a typical Brooklyn neighborhood. Why is that in the mix? So that should be looked at. And it's also my hope that an actual inventory of the stabilized apartments that Albany controls, why don't we know where they are? Why is the onus on the tenant to send a letter to DHCR in Albany to figure out if they're in a stabilized unit or not? Why don't we have an inventory and making sure what we're tearing down to build affordable, we're not actually destroying the preserved units that we have? And finally, for Atlantic Avenue, my hope is that because it's on a major, not just subway line, but the Long Island Railroad, Atlantic Avenue should be for everybody. And I think that our system of using a Long Island Railroad ticket versus a Metro card is really kind of outdated for the city that we are, and that if you're going to build transit-oriented development, those folks should be able to boop their Omni and be in Atlantic Terminal in 5 minutes. They shouldn't be buying a separate app machine. They should be able to be privy to all of the resources that downtown Brooklyn has and be able to enjoy it in the way that people who live in downtown Brooklyn enjoy it, because they really are just 5 minutes away.
Thank you. And thank you, Marcia, for letting us run over a little.
Absolutely. So we have time for just a few questions, but just to remind you, you can mingle, talk more at the little reception afterwards, but we'll take a few questions.
Moving from the general to the very specific, Atlantic Avenue west of Flatbush Avenue has a special zoning district, which I was involved with the creation of. But what do you see as the future of that special zoning district in the context of the preservation discussion and the affordable housing discussion?
So the special zoning district that was referenced is part of the downtown Brooklyn special zoning district in Atlantic Avenue, particularly, which is a sub-district. And in that zoning resolution, there is an emphasis on preserving height, scale, materials, architectural features that are endemic to the corridor. My first reaction would be enforcement. I'm not sure how much of that zoning resolution has been enforced based on some of the buildings I've seen. And it seems to me that the new development that has come, Post House particularly, I think did a great job in terms of its rhythm of its facade, the materials, its reference to the mosque, which is just to the east of it. But I think that with City of Yes and the new City of Yes for Economic Opportunity, I specifically asked the City Planning Commission, will this new zoning override any of the special zoning districts that we have? And the answer was no. So to sum up, my job and our job going forward is when these new developments come in is to make sure that these guidelines are being adhered to. I think that different parts of the avenue can take the growth. I think it makes sense to build bigger on the eastern side, close to what is the Times Square of Brooklyn, and there are already higher density buildings there. But in terms of historic districts, what we have and any upzoning that we may face, there's also the reality that these buildings are older from the 1850s. And when you start touching them, you're going to run into a lot of problems because they're party walled and there is a tunnel under the street. So I think in terms of development, when you're touching a historic property, you need to be extra careful, not just for aesthetics, but because you could lose it.
Hi, good evening. My name is Gib Vacconi, and for about the last 10 years, I've been working with Community Board 8 to facilitate the M-Crown process, which has become the AAMUP process. At the time we began, city policy was that when new subsidized affordable units were created, that the residents of the community district where those were created in the lottery had preference for 50% of those units. About a year ago, the city settled something called the Gurion suit, which challenged that, claiming that that policy was segregationist. So by the time the affordable housing at AAMUP gets built, the Community Board 8 residents will only have preference for about 15% of those units. I can't explain what the heartbreak is for creating that much affordable housing in our district and having our residents only get preference for 15% of those units. So the Community Board has called on HPD to create a new class of preference for people who have been displaced from the community district so they can qualify for preference on 50% of those units that will get created and have an opportunity to move back to the district. And I think when we think about how to preserve community in the context of these rezonings, we need some tool like that. Otherwise, the overwhelming number of market rate units that are created will have a displacing effect. So really would like to see the city be able to move forward with something like that now, so rezonings will become meaningful again to help keep people in the communities that they're a part of. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Sandy Balboza from Atlantic Avenue, where Kelly is our great bid director. Before the bid came in, we had a volunteer organization, and I know a lot of people here because I worked on community issues when we had the Atlantic Avenue Betterment Association. There are so many things my head is spinning about lack of affordable housing, loss of culture, loss of long-time businesses, because this upzoning of downtown, for one thing, brought in, well, it was developer-driven, and anything from landmarking, I saw on Atlantic Avenue when they upzoned, they were tearing down our buildings. Nothing significant yet, but we did, I did reach out to Landmark, so the point about being active is very important. And we did get additional landmarking on the Borum Hill section of Atlantic Avenue. but we were too broken up to get the whole part from Court Street to 4th Avenue. But now there's this city of yes, and I got a call from a developer, realtor developer, who wanted to buy my air rights. So I think everybody has to watch out for what's happening next. We had the downtown plan in 2004. I know Otis Pearsall tried to save some of the historic the historic buildings in downtown, but that's not happening. And when things are torn down, it's usually the low-income properties that go, and the luxury housing gets built. So everybody has to pay attention. And
Thank you. Sorry to interrupt. I was just going to say, I saw a few other questions, so I just wanted to, thank you so much, and I would encourage, let's like mingle and salon those ideas over Damascus, because it's delicious. But I did see one more, I thought, question, so I just, I don't know if they still have, but if you have a question for the panel, I just wanted to end on that note, and then let's please all talk about ideas over the food. Thank you so much.
Hello, my name is Madeline. I just have a funny question. What's going on Atlantic Avenue around Bond Street? Is that a prison going up? You can't hear me? Sorry. Okay. Is that a prison going up on Atlantic near Bond Street?
There is a detention center that is replacing the detention center that was built in 1957 on the north side of Atlantic Avenue between Smith Street and Borum Place. This is part of the borough-based jails, which is the means to an end to close Rikers. And Sandy, who just spoke, has been instrumental in advocating for a better facility, which would focus more on rehabilitation rather than incarceration. And a lot of promises have changed during the course of this process, including the size of the building. You're welcome.
I wanted to give a round of applause to the panelists, but also, wait. Sorry, quickly, yes. But also thank Marcia, and also a call out, I think Genevieve Wagner from Municipal Art Society is here somewhere, but she really helped deliver the reception tonight that you all are about to go enjoy. So thank you to Genevieve Wagner, and thank you again to Center for Brooklyn History.